He crossed the floorboards, each step a measured percussion in the saloon's tired hum. The air was thick with the ghosts of stale beer and sweat, cut through by the sharp scent of cheap whiskey. Sunlight, heavy and gold, fell in solid bars through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like frantic spirits. He saw her before he was halfway to the bar. She sat alone at a small, round table in the corner, a place that offered a clear view of both entrances. A place for watching. A place for waiting. She wore black. A long duster, trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in a permanent twilight. The only thing not black was the delicate white porcelain cup she held with two hands, the steam rising from it in a slow, patient curl. He had heard the stories. They called her the ghost of the territories, a name whispered in bunkhouses and around campfires. They said she moved like smoke and shot like lightning, that her conscience was as barren as the alkali flats. He saw only a woman, still as a statue, drinking tea in a room full of men drinking themselves toward oblivion. His heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs, a frantic drum against the slow, grave melody of the room. He counted the men. He read their hands. He noted the exits, just as he had been taught, but the knowledge brought no comfort. His hands were slick with a nervous sweat, and he wiped them on his worn denim trousers before he reached her table. He did not ask permission. He simply pulled out the opposite chair, its legs scraping a raw complaint from the floor, and Saturday. He felt every eye in the room turn to him, a collective weight of disbelief and morbid curiosity. The piano player faltered, a chord dying with a sad, discordant sigh. The woman did not look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the surface of her tea, a dark, placid mirror. He waited. The silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle, ready to shatter. Finally, she raised her head. Her eyes were dark, unreadable, and held no fear. Not of him, not of the room, not of whatever God might be watching. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time, and her voice, when it came, was low and steady as winter iron. "Sir, wrong table," he heard the words, but what he truly understood was the stillness behind them. The absolute calm. It was the calm of a hawk on the wind, of a coiled snake in the dust. And in that moment, the shy rancher, the man named Thomas, realized she wasn't afraid of him at all. And that was more terrifying than any gun she might carry. He knew then that the stories were true, and that he had found the right person, at the wrongest table of his life. His journey to this place had begun not with a decision, but with a scent. The smell of rain on dry earth, a petrichor promise that had come to nothing for 3 long seasons. The drought had baked his land into a jigsaw of cracked, pale clay. It had stolen the green from the grass and the hope from his heart. The cattle grew thin, their ribs a harsh arithmetic of his failure. It was during one of these long, silent afternoons, while cleaning out the old tack room, that he found the box. It was his wife's. A small, cedar chest he hadn't had the strength to open in the 5 years since she was gone. Now, with everything else turning to dust around him, it felt less like a violation and more like a necessity. A search for something, anything, that still held life. Inside, beneath folded lace and a dried wildflower, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were not from him. They were from her sister, detailing a life he never knew she'd had, in a town he'd never heard of, a place called Redemption. He read them under the weak light of a kerosene lamp, the words blurring as the truth settled over him like a shroud. A history of fear, of a man named Crane who ran the town and the territory around it, of a debt that had been called due in the most brutal way imaginable. And in the last letter, unfinished, was a name. Lynn. A woman who had passed through, a shadow in black who had faced Crane's men and left them wanting. His wife had written of her with a kind of desperate awe, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. Finding the letters was like finding a map to a past he didn't know existed. It gave his grief a direction, a purpose beyond the simple, crushing weight of absence. He sold the last of his herd for a pittance, packed a single bag with the letters and a scorched piece of wood he had carried for 5 years, and rode east. He rode toward Redemption, a name that felt like a bitter joke. The sun was a merciless hammer, the landscape a testament to God's indifference. He was no longer just a man hollowed out by loss. He was a man with a question, and he was hunting for the only person in the world who might hold the answer. The fire had come at night. A new moon, the darkness absolute, a thick blanket of black that swallowed the prairie. He remembered the smell first. Not wood smoke, but something acrid and chemical. Kerosene. He had woken to the heat, a blistering wave that felt like the devil's own breath. The world outside his window was an impossible orange, a furious, roaring dawn in the middle of the night. He had stumbled out of bed, his mind thick with sleep, calling for Martha. He found her in the hallway, her face a mask of terror in the flickering light, clutching their daughter, Sarah, to her chest. "Go," she had screamed, her voice thin against the inferno's roar. Get out the back. He had turned, just for a second, to grab the heavy iron lockbox where they kept their deed and their savings. A foolish, fatal second. A support beam, wreathed in flame, crashed down between them, sealing the hallway in a wall of fire. He saw her face through the shimmering heat, her mouth open in a scream he couldn't hear over the noise. And then he saw something else. A figure standing in the yard, silhouetted against the blaze. Tall, slender, dressed in black, a hat pulled low. The shape was indistinct, a human-shaped hole in the light. Another figure, a man, broad and cruel-looking, stood beside the first. They watched the house burn. They watched it all. He had scrambled out a window, his lungs full of smoke, his skin blistering. He lay in the dirt, helpless, as the home he had built with his own 2 hands was consumed. When the roof finally collapsed, sending a volcano of sparks into the night sky, the 2 figures simply turned and walked away, swallowed by the darkness they had come from. He never saw their faces clearly. He was left with only the silhouette of the one in black, an image seared into his memory as deeply as the burns on his arms. He had told the sheriff, but the law in that county belonged to men like Crane. The fire was ruled an accident. A tragic misfortune. But Thomas knew what he saw. He carried that silhouette with him every day, a second shadow that was always there, a constant reminder of the second he had hesitated, the second that had cost him everything. The town of Redemption was a single, dusty street gasping for air between 2 sun-scorched bluffs. The buildings sagged, their false fronts peeling like sunburnt skin. Packed dirt, gone pale from too much sun, served as the main thoroughfare. There was a livery, a general store, a sheriff's office with a cracked window, and the saloon. He had arrived at midday, the sun directly overhead, bleaching the world of color and shadow. He left his horse at the livery, the stable hand barely glancing at him, his eyes old and tired. Thomas walked the street, feeling the gaze of the few people who were out. They were looks of appraisal, of suspicion. He was a stranger, and in a town like this, a stranger was either a fool or a threat. He saw her from across the street, sitting on a bench outside the general store. She was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the oppressive heat. Her black hat was pulled low, but he knew it was her. The stillness was the same. The absolute economy of motion. People gave her a wide berth. A woman with 2 children hurried past, pulling her kids close and not meeting the figure's gaze. A trio of hard-faced men coming out of the saloon saw her, and their loud talk immediately quieted. They crossed the street to avoid walking past her. She commanded the space around her not with threats, but with presence alone. He stood in the sliver of shade offered by an awning and watched her. He was piecing together the woman from the stories, the name from the letter, and the silhouette from his nightmares. He had to be sure. He needed to see if there was any flicker of recognition, any hint of a shared past in her eyes before he made his move. He watched her for nearly an hour, as the sun began its slow descent and the shadows stretched like grasping fingers across the dusty street. She never looked his way, but he felt certain she knew he was there. She finished with her knife, tested the edge with her thumb, and slid it back into a sheath on her belt. Then she stood, dusted off her trousers, and walked into the saloon. He waited for his heart to slow its frantic pace. Then he followed her in. He sat there, the silence of the saloon a physical pressure against his eardrums. Her eyes, dark and deep, held his. They did not waver. They did not threaten. They simply watched, assessed, and waited. He had come all this way, rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind on the long, dusty ride, but the words caught in his throat a knot of grief and fear. His hand trembled as he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. The other patrons were statues, their drinks forgotten. The piano man remained silent. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic creak of the ceiling fan, stirring the thick, stagnant air. He pulled out the object. It was small, fitting in the palm of his hand. A little wooden bird, carved from pine, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. He had carved it for Sarah on her 5th birthday. It was her favorite toy. He had found it in the dirt days after the fire, miraculously intact save for one side, which was blackened and charred, the delicate details of the feathers erased by a brutal, searing heat. The bird was a perfect symbol of his life, one half filled with gentle memory, the other scarred by an unforgivable violence. He placed it on the table between them, pushing it gently across the polished, beer-sticky wood until it stopped just short of her porcelain teacup. He did not speak. The bird spoke for him. It spoke of a farmhouse on the prairie, of a little girl's laughter, of smoke and ash and a night of impossible orange. It was a question and an accusation all at once. He watched her face for any sign, any flicker of recognition. For a moment, there was nothing. She remained perfectly still, her expression as unreadable as a stone. He felt a cold spike of despair. Had he come all this way for nothing? Was she the wrong person, just another shadow in a world full of them? He had staked the last of his hope on this single, desperate gamble, on the memory of a silhouette against the flames. The little charred bird sat between them, a silent testament to a world that had burned down. Lynn's gaze dropped from Thomas's face to the object on the table. The wooden bird. One side smooth, the other a landscape of black, bubbled ruin. For the briefest of moments, the saloon around her dissolved. The smell of stale whiskey was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of pine and the choking stench of kerosene. The low murmur of the drinkers faded, replaced by the hungry roar of a fire and the distant, thin sound of a woman's scream. It was a memory she had buried deep, packed down with years of dust and distance and blood. She had been younger then, harder in some ways, softer in others. A different name, a different life. She had been a passenger that night, a tool hired for a job she hadn't fully understood until the flames began to rise. The man, Crane, had told her it was an eviction. A show of force to clear a stubborn farmer off land he had acquired. He had not mentioned the family. He had not mentioned the fire. She had stood in the yard, watching the house burn, and a coldness had settled in her soul that had never truly left. She remembered the other silhouette, the farmer, scrambling from a window, a ghost escaping his own tomb. She had done nothing. She had simply watched. It was the moment her path had been irrevocably set. She had taken Crane's money and ridden away, but the image of the burning house became her constant companion. She had spent the years since then carving out a new identity, a fearsome reputation that served as a wall to keep the world, and her own past, at bay. The ghost of the territories. It was a lie built on a foundation of a single, shameful truth. She looked at the bird. She looked at the man. His eyes were not full of hatred or a thirst for revenge. They were filled with a quiet, bottomless grief. He wasn't here to kill her. He was here for something far more complicated. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap near the holstered pistol she always wore, moved to the table. She did not pick up the bird. She simply laid her fingers beside it, her unadorned nails a stark contrast to the scorched wood. It was an acknowledgement. A confession without words. The fortress of her composure held, but inside, the ghost of a girl who watched a house burn had finally been found. "I'm not here for a fight," Thomas said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar in the quiet room. It was the first thing he had said since sitting down, and the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and strange. Lynn did not answer immediately. She withdrew her hand from the table and folded it back in her lap. Her eyes never left his. "Then you're in the wrong town," she finally replied, her voice still a low, even murmur. Her tone was flat, offering neither threat nor comfort. It was a statement of fact. There was another man, Thomas continued, pushing past her dismissal. He had to say it. He had to know. That night. With you. He was broad. A scar above his left eye. He watched her for a reaction, but her face remained a placid mask. Still, he felt a subtle shift in the energy between them. He was no longer a stranger making a mistake, he was a man holding a key to a door she had long since locked. I don't need revenge on you. I need to find him. Why? The single word was sharp, precise. It cut through his prepared speeches, demanding a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to give. Why? Because the man with the scar was the one who had poured the kerosene. He was the one who had laughed as the flames took hold. The silhouette in black had been a watcher, a ghost. But the man with the scar was the devil himself. My wife wrote about you, Thomas said, changing tactics. In a letter. She said you passed through their town. She said you weren't like Crane's other people. She thought. He trailed off, the memory of his wife's hopeful words a fresh pain. She was wrong, Lynn said. The finality in her voice was absolute. It was a door slamming shut. Maybe, Thomas conceded, his gaze dropping to the charred bird. But you were there. You saw his face. I just need a name. A direction. After that, I'll be gone. You'll never see me again. He looked up, meeting her gaze again, and let her see the desperation, the 5 years of emptiness that had led him to this table. Please, it was a word he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long, long time. It was the word of a broken man. And in the unreadable depths of the gunslinger's eyes, he thought he saw, for the first time, a flicker of something other than ice. Lynn held his gaze for a long time. The silence in the saloon was now so complete it felt like a sound in itself. The air was thick with unspoken histories, with the weight of a past that had just been unearthed on a sticky wooden table. She was weighing him. Weighing his story. Weighing the cost of digging up a grave she herself had helped to fill. To give him the name was to acknowledge her part in it. To admit that she was not just a myth, but a woman who had stood by and watched a family burn. It was an act of confession, and confession was a vulnerability she could not afford. But to refuse was to leave this man adrift in his grief, tethered to a ghost she had helped create. She saw the truth in his eyes. He was not a threat. He was a man seeking an end to a story, not a bloody revenge. The man he sought, a brute named Harker, was Crane's right hand. To point Thomas in that direction was to send him to his death. Crane did not tolerate loose ends. Yet, the charred bird sat on the table, a silent judge. The memory of the fire, the shame she had carried like a stone in her gut for 5 years, demanded a penance. This, perhaps, was it. Not redemption. She didn't believe in such things. But a balancing of the scales. A small act of correction in a crooked world. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a promise of help. It was not an offer of partnership. It was simply an answer. Yes. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a ragged, shaky exhalation that spoke of years of tension. Lynn stood up, her movement fluid and silent. She placed a few coins on the table to pay for her tea, her gaze sweeping the room. The other patrons immediately found interest in their drinks, the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but the corner table. She looked down at Thomas. Harker, she said, the name a sharp, ugly sound. He stays at Crane's main ranch, north of here. 2 days' ride. She turned and walked toward the door without a backward glance. She expected him to stay, to take the name and go off to his foolish, noble death. But as she pushed through the saloon's swinging doors into the blazing afternoon sun, she heard his chair scrape back. She heard his footsteps, steady and determined, following her out into the dust. They left redemption as the sun bled across the western horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape of the territories. They rode north, into the deepening twilight. Lynn set a hard pace, her black mare moving with a tireless, ground-eating stride. Thomas kept up on his own sturdy gelding, the silence between them as wide and empty as the plains. This was not a partnership. It was a convergence of paths, a temporary alignment of purpose. He was the ghost of her past made flesh, she was the key to his future. For the first day, they did not speak. The only sounds were the plodding of hooves on dry earth, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of the wind through the sparse, hardy brush. He watched her. He saw the way she rode, not slouched in the saddle but perfectly balanced, an extension of the horse itself. He saw how her eyes constantly swept the horizon, reading the land, searching for threats he could not see. When they stopped for the night, it was in a small, defensible canyon. She built a smokeless fire, a small pit of embers that gave off heat but barely any light. She ate jerky and hardtack, and offered him some without a word. He accepted with a nod. He saw that she did not sleep. While he rested, wrapped in his bedroll, he would open his eyes to see her sitting, watching the darkness, her pistol resting loosely in her lap. She was a sentinel, a guardian of a past she was now forced to confront. He began to understand that the reputation, the black clothes, the name whispered in fear, it was all armor. It was a wall she had built around the memory of a girl who had once stood in a farmer's yard and done nothing. On the second day, as they watered the horses at a small, muddy creek, he spoke. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him from under the brim of her hat, her expression unreadable. "I haven't done anything yet," she replied. "You gave me a name," he said. That was more than anyone else would do. She turned back to her horse, running a hand along its neck. "Don't thank me," she said, her voice low. "I was there." That makes me as guilty as him. It was the closest she had come to an admission, and the closest he had come to understanding her. They were two broken people, riding toward a reckoning, bound by the ashes of a shared memory. They arrived at the ruins on the morning of the third day. The sun was rising, casting long, mournful shadows across the land. From a distance, it looked like a few missing teeth in the prairie's wide grin. As they drew closer, the details emerged, each one a fresh cut in Thomas's memory. The stone foundation of the house was all that remained, a black, skeletal outline against the pale grass. The great oak tree in the yard, where he had hung a swing for Sarah, was a charred, leafless claw reaching for the sky. The barn had collapsed into a heap of blackened timber. This was the geography of his grief. A place he had never had the courage to return to, until now. He dismounted, his legs unsteady. He walked through the space where his front door used to be, his boots crunching on scorched earth and debris. Lynn remained with the horses, a silent watcher on the hill, giving him the space he needed. He walked to the back of the foundation, to the place where the hallway had been. He stood on one side of the imaginary line, the spot where the beam had fallen, and looked across to where Martha and Sarah had been trapped. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear it. The roar of the fire. His wife's last, unheard scream. The weight of his failure, of that one, hesitant second, pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. "It wasn't your fault." Lynn's voice came from behind him, quiet but firm. He turned. She had walked up without a sound, a shadow in the morning light. "The beam was already burning," she said. "You took a step for the box, but it would have fallen anyway." There was no time. No second to spare. "I saw it." He stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. He had carried the guilt of that hesitation for 5 years, believing his greed for a tin box had cost him his family. It had been the cornerstone of his private hell. She was offering him an absolution he never thought possible. "You saw that?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I saw it," she confirmed. "The man, Harker, he's not just a brute. His Crane's enforcer. He will kill you if you face him alone." She looked at him, her gaze direct. "You came here for an answer. You have it. The name, the truth of that second. Go home, Thomas." "This was my home," he said, his voice hollow as he gestured to the ruins. "There's nothing left." He then walked to a small, enclosed plot of land a short distance from the house, marked by 2 simple wooden crosses he had put up himself a week after the fire. He knelt between them. Lynn watched him, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol. The debt was paid. The scales were balanced. But the story did not feel over.